Ukraine's offensive into Russia's Kursk region has taken Moscow and the world by surprise. How did the Ukrainians manage to push through the Russian border so easily and take control of so much territory? And what role are Western weapons playing in this? That's a big question here in Germany, which is Ukraine's second biggest supplier of arms after the US. To talk about this, I'm joined by Rafael Loss, a defence expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations here in Berlin. Mr. Loss, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I want to jump right in. Ukraine's incursion into Russian territory, what does it mean?
I think it's very significant when you look at the narrative that evolved around the war over the past couple of weeks and months. Ukraine was under a lot of pressure in the eastern Donbas region. Russia was making steady progress in its human wave attacks and heavy artillery strikes on Ukrainian frontline defenders, and had been able to push Ukraine back. The incursion into the Kursk region, we're now sort of in the second week of that, has completely shifted the narrative, I think. Ukraine has shown that it is able to mount offensive operations, that it is able to surprise Russia through creative managing of its own armed forces and capabilities. And it is shown that in the broader context of the arrival of F-16 fighter jets, that Ukraine might be able to renew momentum for a bit more of a maneuverist approach in its defensive struggle, to dislodge potentially going forward some of the Russian forces that occupy Ukrainian territory, be it militarily or through a negotiated process.
But how was it so easy? You know, it's at least from the pictures, from the news, what the people might be reading, you'd think, how is this possible?
I think looking back at the past week, images, footage that we've seen out of Kursk region and various border crossings, it seems that the Russian defenses weren't particularly strong. When you recall that in spring of this year, Russia tried to mount offensives into Kharkiv Oblast, into Sumy Oblast. Those are regions in Ukraine that border various southern Russian regions, and withdrew those forces subsequently, but didn't seem to care much about the defenses that were remaining. Ukraine kept an eye on those regions, seemed to have noticed that Russian forces were leaving, relocating to the Donbas, and kept the Ukrainian electronic warfare going to disrupt Russia's surveillance technology, to disrupt Russian drone operations, and thereby establish a bit of an electromagnetic bubble south of the Kursk Oblast, which then allowed Ukraine's armed forces to cross the border largely undetected, it seems. And they've been operating inside Kursk for the past 8 days, with very little disturbance from overhead imagery, such as Russian drones, from Russian aircraft, which suggests that they have brought air defense into Kursk region as well. They've brought about 3 battalions worth of troops initially, and they've been able to reinforce their hold on that region. And so there seems to be a well thought through incursion compared to raids of pro-Ukrainian Russian legionnaires earlier last year, which were much smaller in scale and less effective. This incursion really seems to be a well thought through operation tasked by Ukraine's military leadership. And so far, they've been holding on to this territory. We'll have to see how long that continues and what the ultimate battlefield effects will be of this incursion.
Russian media have reported sightings of the German-made infantry fighting vehicle Marder in the Kursk region, so on Russian soil. That sparked a debate over here about what Ukraine does with weapons supplied by Germany. When are weapons German and when do they become Ukrainian? And could this risk further escalation? What do you think?
There are 2 ways, I think, to look at this. One is a legal way, and the government of Germany, in press statements over the past couple of days, has been very clear on this point. As soon as German-produced weapons are being transferred over to Ukraine's armed forces, they become Ukrainian weapons. So even though a Marder infantry fighting vehicle might be used in this operation, and even though it might have been produced for the German armed forces or in German factories at some point in its lifetime, it is now a Ukrainian weapon system operated by Ukrainian soldiers. So from a legal perspective, it is clearly not that Germany is sort of militarily involved in this incursion by Ukraine's armed forces into Russian territory. Politically, you can look at this with a bit more of a caveat, and not so much on the weapon systems that Ukraine seems to be using for this particular offensive, but we've also seen over the past couple of months a very, very lengthy and drawn-out discussion over long-range rockets and artillery systems, and whether Ukraine is allowed to use these on Russian territory. And here the political calculation, different from the legal assessment, seems to be that there are some escalation concerns that Western governments continue to have regarding Ukraine's use of, for example, the HIMARS rocket system deep into Russian territory. But these political calculations do not attach so much to infantry fighting vehicles like Marder, to various armored tank systems that Ukraine has been using in this offensive. Here, very much the argument is from Germany's government, but also other Western supporters of Ukraine, that this is a Ukrainian operation with Western-provided weapons that are now Ukraine's to operate. And therefore, as long as Ukraine abides by its international humanitarian legal obligations, which for all intents and purposes, it does, it has been doing throughout this war, in contrast very much to Russia's armed forces, that it is allowed to conduct such operations.
I want to go back for just a minute with what you said about, the political side of all of this, because, a few months ago, we had a very, very big discussion in Germany about whether Germany should provide Ukraine with the Taurus missile. From a legal perspective now, does that not raise questions over this decision not to send the Taurus missile systems to Ukraine?
I think it does very much so. Legally, the assessments are as such that if a weapon system is being handed over to Ukraine's armed forces, that it is legally Ukraine's weapon system. With some of the more sophisticated, longer-range systems, it is a bit more complicated in the sense that on some more finer technical points, some assistance by Western, for example, industry contractors might be needed to facilitate their operations. You can decide to not rely on those, but that sort of draws out the training requirements on Ukraine's side much more. But it seems to be still that the political calculation, again, different from the legal calculation, is that providing some of those longer range systems, including Germany's Taurus cruise missile, is a step too far. But maybe we'll get there at some point. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky delights in emphasizing that 2 years ago, everybody was telling him, you'll never get the F-16, and look what happened. Ukraine now flies F-16.
If we take a step back here, this whole incursion, is it covered by international law?
It is. Look, all of this happens in the context of a Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And there are no international legal provisions that would restrain the defender from attacking the aggressor on their own home turf. So in international legal terms, an incursion such as this is very much permissible. What is important is that Ukraine has to, and Western governments continue to emphasize this as well, Ukraine has to abide by international humanitarian legal obligations, such as discrimination, to not strike civilian targets, to treat prisoners of war fairly and justly, to allow access to the International Committee of the Red Cross to POWs and other Russian troops. But for all intents and purposes, again, what we've been able to observe over the past 2.5 years is that Ukraine very much takes seriously those obligations, very much in contrast to Russia, which has been reported by international independent assessments to violate humanitarian international law on an almost daily basis by mistreating prisoners of war, by mistreating Ukrainian civilians, by purposefully targeting Ukrainian hospitals, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, including, for example, for the export of grain from Black Sea ports, and so on and so forth. Again, this incursion, as long as Ukraine abides by its international humanitarian legal obligations, and for all we can say it very much does, is very much legal under international legal terms.
Now, there are politicians here in Germany that argue that this incursion, but also the fact that Russia says German-made Marder infantry fighting vehicles have been found on Russian ground, is an escalation of this conflict. What would you respond to such a statement?
I mean, to some extent, and this is an analytical fine point, but blaming everything or calling every move that Ukraine makes in this defensive struggle an escalation is a bit mute by now. It doesn't tell us much about the dynamics of the war. What we can say is that Ukraine, by facilitating this incursion, seems to be aiming at increasing pressure on Russia and to have some leverage over a potential future negotiation. This is something that Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, in a press conference only yesterday also seemed to recognize. And it seems from an analytical standpoint to make sense. Ukraine does now have some leverage if negotiations came to materialize, potentially towards the end of the year, if a second peace conference, for example, came together to move forward on that question. But different, again, from this legal point, you can come to different conclusions on the political calculus on whether this operation is smart. I think from Ukraine's perspective, it very much is. Again, the leverage point is one. The change of narrative is one, which might increase Ukraine's societal and military resolve and morale, and maybe undermine that of its support in Russia. But the question for leadership in Germany and in Europe among Ukraine supporters is how do they look at this? And of course, populations in some Western countries are concerned that this might spiral out of control, that Russia might do something that leads to an escalation vis-a-vis a NATO country. But then we have to keep in mind that numerous declared Russian red lines have been crossed throughout this war, beginning with a red line around all Western support for Ukraine, going back to February 2022. This is something that Vladimir Putin outright warned Western governments and societies of. And we've crossed that red line pretty far. We've crossed other red lines without having to fear Russian escalation against NATO countries. I think we can rely on NATO's collective defense to give us assurance that something like this remains very, very unlikely. And on the other hand, Ukraine's leadership and society very much seem to take into account that, of course, Russia will continue to strike civilian targets. Of course, it will continue to try to capture additional territory. But again, this was likely taken into account before launching this operation into Kursk. And the calculation was such that taking this initiative here was worth a potential price that Ukraine might pay.
You say the risk of conventional warfare between Russia and NATO is very low, but there are other tools in Russia's toolbox. Could we maybe see more misinformation campaigns and cyber attacks, for example?
Potentially, but we've also have to recognize that Russian hybrid activities against EU countries, against NATO countries, go back much farther than only February 2022. We can think of various assassinations and assassination attempts against Russian dissidents in Western Europe, including in Germany. We can look at assassinations of arms industrialists and weapon storage facilities in the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, for example. Even before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, those weapons were destined for Ukraine after 2014. And so Russian activities have aimed at both undermining Western support for Ukraine since 2014 and even before, but also undermining political cohesion, societal cohesion in Western countries, and this is something that Western governments confront on a daily basis. We can read news about bot farms and disinformation campaigns, fairly sophisticated ones. We can read news about critical undersea infrastructure in the North Sea, Baltic Sea being disrupted, damaged, destroyed, or at risk. We can hear Russian nuclear saber rattling, which is primarily also aimed at undermining sort of the Western confidence in its course of action. But this is something that will not subside. I think Vladimir Putin's Russia has come to the conclusion that it is in a long-term confrontation with Europe, with NATO, with the United States, and that it therefore needs to push on all fronts short of actual war so far. And again, I think that remains very unlikely, but nonetheless, that means that societies will build up their resilience and will recognize Russian disinformation campaigns and will work to contain or even prevent them, ideally in a context where societies support each other, where German intelligence supports neighbors in France, where American intelligence prevents a terrorist attack against a Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. Of course, this was not a Russian activity for all intents and purposes, as we can say now based on the facts that we have. But it speaks to the broader collaborative architecture that Western societies rely on to remain secure, safe, and prosper.
Now, at the last NATO summit, in fact, the United States basically announced that it will temporarily station long-range weapon systems in Germany starting in 2026 as part of the planning of their future permanent stationing. Now, we've spoken about sort of decreasing support in especially Eastern Germany for weapons deliveries to Ukraine. There's also, if you look at the polls, concern about the decision to station long-range weapon systems, US long-range weapon systems in Germany. What would you say to maybe address those concerns?
Today we've heard news from the Financial Times, a report about nuclear targeting plans of the Russian Navy going back to 2008 to 2014. And those very much include targets across Europe, including in Germany. And so we shouldn't be under the impression that because a small number of long-range weapons might arrive in West Germany and other European countries thereafter, that then we become targets because of these weapons. No, I think the reverse is true. We are targets already, and that's why governments across Europe have made the decision to develop and acquire these kinds of long-range strike capabilities. And the purpose here very much is to build up a conventional deterrent vis-a-vis Russia. We're not speaking about nuclear weapons, and this is very much in contrast to NATO's dual-track decision of 1979 and drawn out deployment of American nuclear weapons to Europe. No, this is a purely conventional response to Russia's threat and to Russia's violation of a treaty that prohibited that specific kind of weapons. Russia itself has a large arsenal of various types and kinds of long-range missiles and rockets, and these continue to threaten targets across Europe. What we observe in Ukraine is that those kinds of weapons are being used to strike civilian infrastructure, hospitals, energy infrastructure, and so on. And so if it came to an escalation, which those weapons are supposed to deter, then we would have to assume that these kinds of weapons would be directed against us. But the whole point of this deployment that Germany and the United States announced, a second decision that was taken by various European governments to develop and acquire that kind of capability, very much are aimed at strengthening Europe's collective conventional deterrent vis-a-vis Russia, and not get us into an arms race with potentially nuclear ramifications. Now, this is a conventional response, a very specific one to a very specific problem that we're facing.
Now, there are politicians in Germany who keep making the point that we need to focus on dialogue. especially so with Russia. Where are we on that point? Where are we on dialogue with Russia?
I mean, fundamentally, I very much agree. You don't do arms control, for example, with your BFFs internationally, but you do arms control with potential adversaries in order to constrain potential escalation horizontally, vertically, what have you. So dialogue with any country around the world, especially those where we have an adversarial relationship, is critically important. And I'm the first to say that, of course, continued engagement with Russia offers to negotiate arms reductions are very much on the table. This is something, again, that NATO countries at the Washington summit reiterated, that they very much see a value for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation for stability in Europe, for security in Europe. But we also have to recognize that regardless of what we sort of come up as an offer in Germany and in NATO, needs to be reciprocated in some way. And what we've seen since February 2022 is that Russia ties any engagement on, for example, arms control to the question of Western support for Ukraine. And that, I think, the calculation there is that Western leaders have made that Ukraine supporting Ukraine, its territorial independence and sovereignty at this time is of higher value than engaging in thorough arms control negotiations with Russia. But of course, if Russia were to untie this package, then I see some potential for renewed arms control negotiations between Russia and NATO countries. But at the moment, this does not seem very likely. Nevertheless, we should prepare what we would like to see coming out of such negotiations.
Mr. Loss, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.